In the early hours of a cold February morning in Hampton, Virginia, a frantic 911 call shattered the silence of the city's most exclusive neighborhood. A woman's terrified voice begged for help, claiming she had just survived a brutal attack in her own home. The evidence seemed undeniable, the trauma appeared genuine, and the community's sympathy was immediate. But sometimes the most convincing performance can hide the darkest deception. What happens when the perfect victim turns out to be the perfect criminal? This is the story of how one woman's desperation led her to orchestrate the most elaborate fraud Hampton had ever seen, and how a simple DNA test brought her entire world crashing down. The emergency dispatcher's screen lit up at exactly 3:47 a.m. on February 15, 2024. The caller ID showed an address that made her sit up straighter. 1247 Bayshore Drive, one of Hampton's most exclusive waterfront properties, where million-dollar mansions overlooked the dark waters of the Chesapeake Bay. 911, what's your emergency? Her voice cut through the static. The response was barely coherent through gasping sobs. Please, someone broke into my house. He attacked me. I need help. Please hurry. The voice belonged to Vivian Ashworth, though the dispatcher wouldn't learn this until later. All she heard was pure terror, the kind that couldn't be faked, the kind that sent chills down experienced operators' spines even after years of handling. Crisis calls. Ma'am, I need you to stay on the line. Are you hurt? Is the intruder still in your home? I don't know. I think he's gone. There's blood everywhere. Please just send someone. Within minutes, Hampton police units were racing through the empty streets, their sirens piercing the pre-dawn silence of Virginia's sleeping coastal city. The first officer to arrive, Sergeant Maria Santos, had worked these wealthy neighborhoods for over a decade. She'd seen domestic disputes, burglaries, and the occasional drug overdose among the children of Hampton's elite. But nothing had prepared her for what she found at 1247 Bayshore Drive. The front door hung open, swaying gently in the February wind that carried the salt scent of the nearby bay. Broken glass crunched under Santos's boots as she entered the foyer, her flashlight beam revealing a scene of absolute chaos. Furniture had been overturned, expensive artwork lay shattered on the marble floor, and dark stains that could only be blood created a trail leading deeper into the house. Hampton Police, ma'am, where are you? A weak voice called from upstairs. Here, in the bedroom. Santos found Vivian Ashworth huddled in the corner of what had once been an immaculate master suite. The 34-year-old marketing executive was barely recognizable, her blonde hair matted with blood, her silk nightgown torn and stained, defensive wounds visible on her hands and arms. Her left eye was swollen shut, and bruises covered her neck in what appeared to be finger marks. It's okay. You're safe now, Santos said, immediately calling for paramedics and additional units. Can you tell me what happened? Vivian's voice came in broken whispers between sobs. He was wearing a mask, came through the back door. I tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. As EMTs worked to stabilize Vivian, Detective Marcus Sterling arrived at the scene. At 42, Sterling had seen enough crime scenes to know the real from the staged, and everything about this scene screamed authentic violence. The 20-year veteran of the Hampton Police Department had earned his reputation solving complex cases through methodical investigation and an almost supernatural ability to read crime scenes. Sterling walked through the house with the careful eye of someone who understood that every detail mattered. The back door's lock had been forced, consistent with Vivian's account. Kitchen knives were scattered on the floor, suggesting the victim had attempted to defend herself. Blood spatter patterns on the walls told a story of struggle and desperation. This wasn't random, Sterling muttered to himself, noting the precision with which certain valuable items had been ignored while others were taken. This was personal, targeted, designed to send a message. As dawn broke over Hampton's waterfront district, news of the attack began to spread through the tight-knit community. Vivian Ashworth wasn't just another victim. She was one of Hampton's rising stars, a successful businesswoman who'd built a marketing firm from nothing and become a fixture at charity events and social gatherings. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through a community that prided itself on safety and exclusivity. By 7 a.m., Detective Sterling had established a perimeter around the Ashworth mansion and called in the department's best forensic specialist. This case would require every tool in their arsenal, every technique they'd learned, and every instinct they'd developed. What Sterling didn't know was that he was about to enter a game where the rules had been rewritten by someone who understood the system better than he did. The perfect crime scene was about to become the perfect trap. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived at the Bayshore Drive mansion as the morning sun cast long shadows across the crime scene. As Hampton's leading forensic specialist, she'd built her reputation on an unwavering commitment to letting evidence tell the story, regardless of how compelling human testimony might be. Her doctoral dissertation on DNA analysis had revolutionized how Virginia's crime labs processed evidence, and her expertise had solved dozens of cases that seemed impossible to crack. "What do we have, Marcus?" she asked, pulling on latex gloves as she approached Detective Sterling. "Home invasion, sexual assault, victims at Hampton General," Sterling replied, his notebook filled with preliminary observations. "Vivian Ashworth, 34, lives alone since her divorce finalized 6 months ago. Someone forced entry through the back door around 3 a.m., attacked her in the bedroom, fled when she managed to call 911. Dr. Vasquez nodded, but her attention was already focused on the physical evidence, the blood patterns, the arrangement of disturbed furniture, the location of discarded items. Each detail would be catalogued, photographed, and analyzed with scientific precision. In her 15 years of forensic work, she'd learned that crime scenes rarely lied, even when people did. At Hampton General Hospital, Detective Sterling found Vivian Ashworth in a private room, her injuries tended to but her trauma clearly visible. Despite the bandages and bruises, she insisted on providing a detailed statement about her ordeal. "I always double-check the locks." "Before bed," Vivian began, her voice steady despite the obvious pain. "But I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. By the time I realized someone was in the house, he was already upstairs." Sterling leaned forward, his recorder capturing every word. "Can you describe the attacker?" "Tall, maybe 6 feet. He was wearing a black ski mask and dark clothes. He had gloves on. I remember that clearly because when he grabbed me, the latex felt cold against my skin." Vivian's composure was remarkable for someone who'd endured such trauma, Sterling noted. Many victims couldn't provide such detailed descriptions so soon after an attack. "Did he say anything? Any distinctive voice or accent?" "He kept telling me to shut up, to stop fighting." His voice was deep, maybe mid-30s or 40s, no accent that I could detect. Vivian touched the bruises on her throat gingerly. "He said he'd been watching me, that he knew I lived alone now." The detail sent a chill through Sterling. This wasn't a random break-in. Someone had been stalking Vivian Ashworth, studying her patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. "How did you manage to call for help?" "When he went to search the other rooms for valuables, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. I could hear him downstairs going through my office. That's when I called 911. Back at the mansion, Dr. Vasquez was discovering evidence that supported every aspect of Vivian's account. Fingerprints on the forced back door appeared to belong to someone wearing gloves. Only smudged impressions remained. DNA samples from blood found throughout the house would need laboratory analysis, but preliminary tests suggested multiple blood types, indicating both victim and perpetrator had been injured during the struggle. The most compelling evidence was found in the master bedroom. Torn fabric from what appeared to be the attacker's clothing was caught on the broken bedpost. Strands of dark hair, not matching Vivian's blonde locks, were discovered on the carpet. The arrangement of overturned furniture suggested a violent struggle that had moved from the bed to the bathroom and back. "This is textbook," Dr. Vasquez told her assistant as they processed the scene. "The perpetrator was methodical but made mistakes. We'll have enough physical evidence to build a solid case once we identify a suspect." News of the attack spread rapidly through Hampton's social circles. By noon, the story had reached local media, and by evening, it was the lead story on Virginia's news channels. The image of Vivian Ashworth, successful, independent, now brutally victimized in her own home, struck a chord with viewers across the state. Hampton's mayor held an emergency press conference, promising that the city's resources would be dedicated to finding Vivian's attacker. Citizens organized neighborhood watch groups and demanded increased police patrols. The Hampton Women's Business Association, of which Vivian was a prominent member, announced a reward fund for information leading to the perpetrator's arrest. Detective Sterling felt the pressure mounting as he returned to headquarters that evening. The community wanted answers, the media wanted updates, and his superiors wanted results. But something nagged at him about the case, not doubt about Vivian's account, which seemed unshakable, but rather the professional way the crime had been executed. As he reviewed the evidence log, Sterling couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. The attacker had been careful enough to wear gloves and a mask, smart enough to avoid security cameras, yet sloppy enough to leave DNA evidence and torn clothing behind. It was a contradiction that would keep him awake long into the night. What Sterling didn't know was that every piece of evidence had been placed with surgical precision. Every detail of Vivian's story had been rehearsed and refined, and the most dangerous criminal in Hampton was lying in a hospital bed, receiving flowers and sympathy cards from an entire community she had expertly deceived. Detective Sterling's investigation began in earnest on the third day after the attack, once Vivian had been released from the hospital and was recovering at her sister's home in Norfolk. The mansion on Bayshore Drive remained sealed as a crime scene while Dr. Vasquez's team completed their forensic analysis. But Sterling had learned enough about Vivian Ashworth to know that her life wasn't as perfect as it appeared from the outside. The financial records painted a troubling picture. Despite her successful marketing firm, Ashworth Creative Solutions, Vivian was drowning in debt. The mortgage on her waterfront mansion was 3 months behind, credit cards were maxed out at nearly $180,000, and her business accounts showed a steady decline in client revenue over the past 18 months. The economic downturn had hit luxury marketing firms particularly hard, and Vivian's high-end lifestyle had become unsustainable. She was living on borrowed time, Sterling told Dr. Vasquez as they reviewed bank statements in the police station's conference room. The mortgage company was beginning foreclosure proceedings. Her car was about to be repossessed. She had maybe 6 weeks before everything collapsed. Dr. Vasquez looked up from the forensic report spread across the table. People don't usually get attacked when they're already at rock bottom, unless someone saw an opportunity, Sterling finished. Someone who knew about her financial troubles, knew she was vulnerable. The detective's next discovery made the case even more intriguing. Vivian had recently increased her homeowner's insurance policy, adding a specific rider for violent crimes that would pay out $500,000 in addition to medical expenses and property damage. The policy had been purchased just 2 months before the attack, and the insurance agent remembered Vivian specifically asking about coverage for targeted attacks and home invasions. Sterling's phone buzzed with a text from the insurance investigator. Red flags everywhere. Policy increase, specific crime coverage, financial distress. Recommend thorough investigation before any payout. But the physical evidence seemed to contradict any suggestion of insurance fraud. Dr. Vasquez's preliminary forensic report was comprehensive and damning for whoever had attacked Vivian. Blood evidence from multiple locations throughout the house, DNA material that didn't match the victim, signs of forced entry, and testimony that remained consistent through multiple interviews. The attacker knew the house layout, Sterling noted, studying crime scene photos, went straight to the bedroom, knew exactly where to find valuables in the home office, avoided the security system panel in the kitchen. This was someone familiar with Vivian's routines. The timeline reconstruction revealed disturbing details about the level of planning involved. The attacker had waited until 3 a.m., the deepest point of sleep for most people. The back door had been targeted because it was hidden from street view by mature landscaping. Even the choice to attack on a Tuesday night showed knowledge of Vivian's schedule. She typically worked late on weekdays and was most likely to be alone and exhausted. Sterling's investigation into Vivian's recent life changes revealed a pattern of increasing isolation. Her divorce from Derek Caldwell had been acrimonious, ending a 5-year marriage that had deteriorated as her business struggled and his pharmaceutical sales career flourished. Friends described increasing tension between the couple over money, with Vivian becoming secretive about her company's financial problems. She started canceling dinner plans, avoiding social events, her friend Rachel Morrison told Sterling during an interview at her Virginia Beach office. We all thought it was because of the divorce drama, but looking back, I think she was embarrassed about the money problems. Vivian always had to be perfect, had to have everything under control. The Hampton Police Department's Victim Services Coordinator, Sarah Chen, had been working with Vivian since the attack and noticed unusual aspects to her recovery process. Unlike most trauma victims, Vivian seemed remarkably focused on practical concerns rather than emotional healing. She's been asking detailed questions about the investigation timeline, about when the crime scene will be released, about insurance procedures, Chen reported to Sterling. Most victims can barely think about anything except their safety in the first few weeks. Vivian seems prepared for this process. Dr. Vasquez was conducting her most detailed analysis yet of the physical evidence when she noticed the first inconsistency. The blood spatter patterns in the bedroom suggested a struggle that had moved in a specific direction, from the bed toward the bathroom. But the distribution of DNA evidence told a slightly different story, with the highest concentration of foreign genetic material found near the bedroom window rather than along the apparent path of struggle. "It's probably nothing," she told her lab assistant while reviewing microscopic blood samples. "But the evidence placement is almost too convenient. Every sample we've found has been in locations that would be easy to discover during a standard forensic investigation." Meanwhile, Sterling was building a list of potential suspects based on Vivian's account and the evidence of premeditation. The attacker clearly knew intimate details about her life, her home, and her schedule. The pool of people with such access was relatively small, and Sterling was about to begin the process of elimination that would lead him down a path no one expected. As the investigation entered its first week, Hampton remained on edge. The attack on Vivian Ashworth had shattered the community's sense of security, and residents were demanding answers. Local hardware stores reported unprecedented sales of security systems and door locks. Women's self-defense classes filled to capacity. The mayor's office fielded dozens of calls daily from residents asking about police protection and investigation progress. But in the sterile environment of the police forensic lab, Dr. Vasquez was beginning to question whether the evidence was telling the story everyone wanted to hear. Science, she had learned, was often more complicated than it appeared on television crime shows. And sometimes, the most convincing evidence could be the most dangerous deception of all. Derek Caldwell learned about his ex-wife's attack from a news alert on his phone while reviewing pharmaceutical sales reports in his downtown Hampton office. The 36-year-old district manager for MedTech Solutions had been expecting another routine Tuesday until Vivian's face appeared on his screen under the headline, "Local businesswoman brutally attacked in home invasion." His first instinct was genuine concern. Despite their bitter divorce, he'd once loved the woman who was now lying in a hospital bed. His second instinct was dread, knowing that in any investigation, the ex-husband would be the prime suspect. Detective Sterling arrived at Derek's office that afternoon with questions that quickly turned from routine to accusatory. Derek's alibi for the night of February 15th was problematic. He'd been home alone, working on quarterly reports until nearly 2 a.m., then gone to bed. No witnesses, no phone calls, no digital footprint that could verify his location during the crucial hours between 3 and 4 a.m. "You still have keys to the house on Bayshore Drive," Sterling stated, not asking. "Vivian changed the locks after the divorce was finalized," Derek replied, though sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the February chill. "Look, detective, I know how this looks, but I would never hurt Vivian. Never." Sterling's investigation into Derek's background revealed a man under significant financial and emotional stress. The divorce had cost him nearly half of his assets, including his stake in a rental property investment that had been his retirement plan. Court documents showed he'd been fighting the alimony payments, claiming Vivian's business income was higher than she'd reported during proceedings. "She was hiding money," Derek told Sterling during a formal interview at police headquarters. "That marketing firm was doing better than she claimed in court. I was paying her $2,000 a month in alimony while she was living in a mansion I helped buy." The bitter tone in Derek's voice didn't help his case, nor did the series of increasingly angry text messages he'd sent Vivian in the weeks before the attack. The messages, retrieved from phone company records, painted a picture of a man growing desperate about his financial obligations. "This is ridiculous, Viv. You're bankrupting me while living like a queen," read one message from January 28th. "I know you're hiding income. When I prove it, you'll pay back every penny," read another from February 3rd. The most damaging message had been sent just 5 days before the attack. "You can't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, everyone will see who you really are." Dr. Vasquez found Derek's DNA in several locations throughout the Bayshore Drive mansion, but that evidence was compromised by the fact that he'd lived there for 3 years during the marriage. More troubling was the discovery of his fingerprints on a kitchen knife that had been left on the counter during the attack, a knife that showed microscopic traces of blood. "He could have handled that knife any time during the marriage," Dr. Vasquez explained to Sterling, "but the blood traces are fresh, probably from the night of the attack." Derek's explanation was plausible but unprovable. I cut myself making dinner the last time I was there to pick up some belongings. That was maybe 3 weeks ago. Vivian was at work, so I used my key one last time. Sterling pressed harder. Vivian says she changed the locks. She did, but not until after that visit. I left the key on the kitchen counter and never went back. The detective team investigating Derek's background found additional concerning information. His pharmaceutical sales route included several rural counties where break-ins had increased in recent months. While there was no direct connection to those crimes, the pattern suggested someone with knowledge of security systems and law enforcement response times. Derek's co-workers at MedTech Solutions provided character references. That complicated the investigation further. His supervisor, Janet Torres, described him as methodical and detail-oriented, but he's been under tremendous stress since the divorce. Derek knows anatomy, knows about trauma and injury from his medical sales background, Torres added, but he's not violent. I've never seen him lose his temper even when deals fall through. The interview that sealed Derek's fate as the primary suspect came when Sterling asked about his whereabouts on February 14th, the day before the attack. Derek admitted to driving past the Bayshore Drive mansion just to see if she was keeping up with maintenance. I still felt responsible for the property, Derek explained. We bought it together, and I wanted to make sure she wasn't letting it deteriorate. Sterling's suspicion intensified. So you were conducting surveillance on your ex-wife? No, it wasn't surveillance. I drove by once, maybe twice in the past month. The house represented 5 years of my life. By the end of the first week, Derek Caldwell had become Hampton's most hated man. Local media had obtained court documents detailing the contentious divorce, painting him as a bitter ex-husband seeking revenge against the woman who'd taken everything from him. Social media groups formed overnight, with residents sharing Derek's photo and demanding his arrest. The pressure on Sterling to make an arrest was overwhelming, but something bothered him about Derek as a suspect. The man seemed genuinely shocked by the brutality of the attack, and his emotional responses during interviews appeared authentic. More troubling was Derek's complete cooperation with the investigation. He'd voluntarily provided DNA samples, submitted to polygraph tests, and answered every question without demanding a lawyer. Still, the evidence was pointing in one direction, and Hampton wanted justice for Vivian Ashworth. Derek Caldwell was about to become the prime suspect. In a case that would change everyone's understanding of victim and perpetrator, truth and deception, Jordan Hayes had been living out of his rusted Ford pickup truck for 3 weeks when Hampton police found him at a rest stop outside the city limits. The 41-year-old drifter with weathered hands and hollow eyes had been moving up the East Coast since his release from a North Carolina prison 6 months earlier, picking up odd jobs and trying to stay invisible to law enforcement. His visibility became a problem on February 16th when Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a 73-year-old retiree who lived 2 blocks from Vivian Ashworth's mansion, called police to report a suspicious man she'd seen walking through the Bayshore district on the night of the attack. He was moving between the streetlights trying to stay in the shadows, Mrs. Patterson told Detective Sterling during their interview in her meticulously maintained colonial home. I was up with insomnia, looking out my bedroom window when I saw him around 2:30 a.m. Tall, dark clothes, walking with purpose. Not the kind of person you see in our neighborhood. Sterling found Jordan 3 days later, and the man's criminal record made him an immediate person of interest. 2 prior convictions for breaking and entering, 1 assault charge from a bar fight in 2019, and a pattern of targeting affluent neighborhoods for petty theft. His most recent incarceration had been for burglarizing vacation homes in the Outer Banks, a crime that showed planning and knowledge of security systems. I've been clean since I got out, Jordan insisted during his first interview at Hampton Police Headquarters. His voice carried the rough edge of someone who'd spent too many years making bad decisions. I'm just trying to get to Baltimore, find steady work, maybe reconnect with my sister. Sterling wasn't convinced. What were you doing in the Bayshore district at 2:30 a.m. on February 15th? Jordan's explanation was simple but difficult to verify. He claimed he'd been walking from a 24-hour diner on Mercury Boulevard back to the rest stop where he'd parked his truck, a route that would have taken him through Hampton's wealthiest neighborhood. He'd chosen that path, he said, because it was well lit and felt safer than walking along the highway. Look, detective, I know how this looks. Guy like me walking around rich people's houses in the middle of the night. But I wasn't casing anything. I just wanted to get back to my truck without getting mugged or arrested. Dr. Vasquez's forensic analysis found no physical evidence linking Jordan to the crime scene, no fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers from his clothing in the Ashworth mansion. But the timeline was problematic. Jordan's route would have taken him past Vivian's house around the same time the attack occurred. The investigation into Jordan's recent activities revealed troubling patterns. Security footage from a Hampton grocery store showed him purchasing zip ties, duct tape, and a utility knife just 2 days before the attack. The items could have legitimate uses for someone living out of a truck, but they also matched materials commonly used in home invasions. "I needed to fix my tarp," Jordan explained when confronted with the receipts. "The knife was for cutting rope, the tape was for patching holes in my truck bed cover. I wasn't planning anything." Sterling's background check revealed that Jordan had worked briefly for a security company in 2018, giving him knowledge of alarm systems and police response protocols. More damaging was the discovery that he'd been researching Hampton's affluent neighborhoods on public computers at the Norfolk Public Library, accessing real estate websites that showed property values and neighborhood layouts. "I was looking for work opportunities," Jordan said. "Rich neighborhoods mean landscaping jobs, pool, maintenance, handyman work. I wasn't planning any crimes." The Hampton community's reaction to Jordan's arrest was swift and unforgiving. Local news coverage focused on his criminal history and transient lifestyle, painting him as exactly the kind of predator residents feared. Social media exploded with demands for tougher laws against drifters and vagrants who threatened neighborhood safety. Jordan's court-appointed attorney, Maria Santos, no relation to the police sergeant, faced an uphill battle defending a client who seemed designed for the role of villain. "He's an easy target," she told the media. "A homeless ex-convict with no alibi and a history that fits the narrative everyone wants to believe." But Sterling's experienced eye noticed inconsistencies in Jordan as a suspect. The man's surprise at the details of Vivian's attack seemed genuine, and his knowledge of the crime came entirely from news reports rather than inside information. More puzzling was his complete lack of connection to Vivian Ashworth. No evidence that he'd ever seen her, researched her, or targeted her specifically. The detective's instincts were troubled by another factor. Jordan's method of operation in previous crimes had been opportunistic and sloppy, targeting empty vacation homes where he could steal electronics and jewelry without confronting victims. The precision and personal nature of Vivian's attack didn't match his criminal profile. Still, the evidence of Jordan's presence in the neighborhood at the crucial time, combined with his criminal history and recent purchases, made him a viable suspect. Hampton's citizens wanted someone to blame for the attack that had shattered their sense of security, and Jordan Hayes fit their expectations perfectly. As Sterling prepared arrest warrants for both Derek Caldwell and Jordan Hayes, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial about the case. The evidence pointed to multiple suspects, but something about the crime itself felt orchestrated, as if he was being led toward conclusions rather than discovering them naturally. In the forensic laboratory, Dr. Vasquez was about to make a discovery that would change everything everyone thought they knew about the attack on Vivian Ashworth and the nature of evidence itself. Dr. Elena Vasquez had spent 15 years examining crime scenes, but the evidence from 1247 Bayshore Drive was troubling her in ways she couldn't initially articulate. As she conducted her third comprehensive review of the physical evidence, patterns emerged that challenged everything the investigation had assumed about the attack on Vivian Ashworth. The blood spatter analysis revealed the first significant anomaly. In most violent struggles, blood distribution follows chaotic patterns that reflect the unpredictable nature of combat. But the blood evidence in Vivian's bedroom showed an almost methodical placement, drops and smears located in positions that would be immediately visible to forensic investigators, while areas where genuine struggle typically leaves trace evidence remained suspiciously clean. "Look at this," Dr. Vasquez told her lab assistant, Dr. James Chen, as they examined high-resolution photographs of the crime scene. "The blood trail moves from the bed to the bathroom, but there's no evidence of impact spatter on the walls. In a genuine violent struggle, we'd expect to see arterial spray patterns, cast-off blood from the weapon, defensive spatter from the victim's movements." Dr. Chen leaned over the evidence board, studying the pattern analysis charts. "The distribution is almost too convenient. Every sample we've collected has been in locations that standard forensic protocols would examine first. The DNA evidence presented even more troubling inconsistencies. While the foreign genetic material found throughout the house didn't match Vivian's profile, the preservation and distribution of that DNA was unusually pristine. In most violent crimes, DNA evidence is degraded by environmental factors, contaminated by multiple touch points, and mixed with other biological materials. The samples from the Ashworth mansion were textbook perfect, isolated, uncontaminated, and placed in locations that would guarantee discovery. Dr. Vasquez's most disturbing discovery came when she analyzed the timing of cellular degradation in the blood. Samples. Using advanced techniques that could determine approximately when blood had been shed, she found inconsistencies that didn't match the reported timeline of the attack. This blood wasn't deposited at 3 a.m., she told Detective Sterling during an emergency meeting at the police laboratory. The cellular breakdown suggests these samples were placed hours earlier, possibly as much as 6 to 8 hours before the 911 call. Sterling felt his stomach drop. Are you saying the crime scene was staged? I'm saying the physical evidence doesn't support the timeline we've been working with. Either our testing methods are wrong, which is highly unlikely, or someone had access to fresh blood and DNA material well before the reported attack occurred. The implications were staggering. If the crime scene had been staged, then everything they'd assumed about the case was wrong. The suspects they'd been investigating, the motives they'd explored, the community, outrage and media attention, all of it based on a foundation that was beginning to crumble under scientific scrutiny. Dr. Vasquez's investigation took a darker turn when she examined Vivian's medical records from Hampton General Hospital. The pattern of injuries was consistent with violent trauma, but the medical examiner's notes revealed subtle inconsistencies that suggested possible self-infliction. Defensive wounds typically appear on the palms and forearms as victims try to protect themselves, Dr. Vasquez explained to Sterling, but Vivian's wounds are located on the backs of her hands and outer arms, positions that would be almost impossible to achieve while defending against an attacker. The forensic expert's most damning discovery came when she analyzed fabric fibers found embedded in Vivian's wounds. The threads didn't match any clothing or materials from the crime scene, but they did match surgical gauze and medical tape, materials that could be used to create controlled injuries that would appear authentic to emergency room physicians. Someone with medical knowledge could have created these wounds using sterile techniques that would minimize infection risk while maximizing visual impact, Dr. Vasquez reported. The injuries look severe but avoid major arteries, nerve clusters, and organs that could cause permanent damage. Sterling's investigation into Vivian's background revealed a crucial detail that had been overlooked. Before switching to marketing, she'd completed 3 years of pre-medical studies at the Medical College of Virginia, including coursework in anatomy, forensic pathology, and trauma medicine. She'd dropped out to pursue business opportunities, but her transcript showed exceptional grades in subjects that would provide intimate knowledge of injury patterns and forensic procedures. The detective's review of Vivian's recent activities uncovered another troubling pattern. In the months before the attack, she'd been researching topics that seemed innocuous individually, but formed a disturbing picture when combined. Insurance claim procedures, DNA evidence collection, trauma psychology, and forensic investigation techniques. Her browser history, recovered from her home computer, showed visits to law enforcement websites, medical journals, and even true crime forums discussing perfect crimes. Dr. Vasquez's final analysis of the DNA evidence provided the smoking gun that would unravel Vivian's elaborate deception. Using advanced genetic sequencing techniques, she discovered that the foreign DNA found throughout the crime scene had been preserved using laboratory-grade storage methods. Specifically, the samples showed signs of chemical stabilizers used to prevent degradation in research settings. This DNA wasn't deposited naturally during a struggle, Dr. Vasquez concluded. It was collected, preserved, and then strategically placed throughout the house. Someone with knowledge of forensic procedures created this evidence specifically to mislead our investigation. The revelation that the Hampton Police Department had been chasing shadows for 2 weeks sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Derek Caldwell and Jordan Hayes, both facing potential charges for a crime that may never have occurred as reported, were suddenly victims of a deception so sophisticated it had fooled experienced investigators. But the most disturbing realization was yet to come. If Vivian Ashworth had orchestrated this elaborate fraud, then the woman lying in a hospital bed, receiving sympathy and support from an entire community, was actually the most dangerous criminal Hampton had ever encountered. Sterling felt the weight of the investigation shifting beneath his feet as he prepared to confront a suspect who had been hiding in plain sight as the perfect victim. Detective Sterling stared at the evidence board in the Hampton Police Department's conference room, his 20 years of investigative experience struggling to process what Dr. Vasquez's forensic analysis had revealed. Every assumption, every theory, every direction the investigation had taken was now suspect. The victim had become the perpetrator, and the case that had seemed so straightforward was actually the most complex fraud in Hampton's history. "We need to proceed carefully," Sterling told his supervisor, Captain Rebecca Martinez, as they reviewed the forensic findings. "If Vivian Ashworth orchestrated this entire scenario, she's been playing us from the beginning. Every interview, every piece of evidence, every emotional appeal, it was all calculated." Captain Martinez, a 30-year veteran who'd seen every type of crime imaginable, shook her head in disbelief. "The community is ready to lynch Derek Caldwell and Jordan Hayes. How do we tell them that the woman they've been rallying around is actually the criminal?" Sterling's first step was to re-examine every interaction with Vivian through the lens of deception rather than victimization. Her detailed account of the attack, which had seemed so compelling in its specificity, now appeared rehearsed and overly perfect. Real trauma victims typically struggled with memory gaps, contradictory details, and emotional fragmentation. Vivian's narrative had been too polished, too complete. The detective's review of hospital records revealed another troubling pattern. Vivian had been remarkably composed during medical examinations, asking detailed questions about evidence collection procedures that most genuine victims wouldn't think to consider. She'd specifically requested that certain injuries be photographed from multiple angles and had insisted on providing DNA samples immediately, claiming she wanted to help the investigation. She was directing her own evidence collection, Sterling realized, making sure we documented exactly what she wanted us to see. Dr. Vasquez's continued analysis of the physical evidence uncovered more anomalies that supported the fraud theory. The torn fabric allegedly from the attacker's clothing contained fibers that matched garments found in Vivian's own closet, specifically a black sweatshirt that had been deliberately damaged and then discarded in a dumpster 3 blocks from her house. Security footage from a nearby business showed Vivian herself disposing of the clothing 2 days after the reported attack. The most damaging evidence came from Vivian's own medical background. Sterling's investigation revealed that she'd maintained contact with several classmates from her pre-med program, including Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who now worked at a private medical laboratory in Norfolk. Phone records showed multiple calls between Vivian and Dr. Mitchell in the weeks before the attack, conversations that Dr. Mitchell initially claimed were social, but later admitted involved requests for hypothetical information about DNA preservation and evidence collection. She asked me about how long DNA samples could be stored, what chemicals were used to prevent degradation, how forensic labs processed evidence. Dr. Mitchell told Sterling during a tense interview, "I thought she was working on a consulting project for her marketing firm. She said she had a client in the medical field." Sterling's team discovered that Vivian had been collecting biological materials for weeks before the staged attack. Hair samples from Derek's belongings left behind after the divorce. Saliva from drinking glasses used by Jordan Hayes at the diner where he'd eaten, obtained by bribing a busboy. Even blood samples from both men acquired through elaborate deceptions involving fake medical screenings she'd arranged through temporary employment agencies. She created a biological evidence kit, Dr. Vasquez explained to the investigative team. Everything needed to frame multiple suspects was collected and preserved weeks in advance. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was a meticulously planned fraud. The psychological profile of Vivian Ashworth began to shift as Sterling interviewed people who'd known her throughout her adult life. Former colleagues described a woman obsessed with control and perfection, someone who couldn't tolerate failure and would go to extraordinary lengths to maintain her image of success. "Vivian always had to be the smartest person in the room," said Rebecca Torres, her former business partner at Ashworth Creative Solutions. "When the company started failing, she became secretive and paranoid. She was convinced that everyone around her was incompetent, that she was the only one who could fix things." Sterling's investigation into Vivian's recent activities revealed the full scope of her desperation, beyond the financial troubles already. Discovered, she was facing potential criminal charges for tax evasion and had been using client funds to cover personal expenses. The Virginia Attorney General's office had been preparing to investigate her business practices, a development that would have destroyed her professionally and personally. She was trapped, Sterling told Dr. Vasquez as they reviewed the timeline of events leading to the staged attack. The insurance payout wasn't just about money, it was about buying time and shifting attention away from her business problems. A sympathetic victim doesn't get investigated for financial crimes. The detective's most crucial discovery came when he examined Vivian's insurance policies more closely. The violent crime rider she'd added wasn't just for $500,000. It included provisions for temporary relocation expenses, psychological counseling, and business interruption coverage that could total over $1.2 million. The policy had been crafted specifically to provide comprehensive financial relief for someone facing complete economic collapse. But Vivian's plan had a fatal flaw that she couldn't have anticipated. Dr. Vasquez's cutting-edge forensic techniques were more advanced than the ones Vivian had researched during her planning phase. The DNA analysis methods that revealed the evidence tampering had been developed only in the past 2 years, after Vivian had completed her research into forensic procedures. She planned for 2022 forensic science, but we're using 2024 technology, Dr. Vasquez observed. The techniques that exposed her fraud didn't exist when she was learning how to fool our investigation. Sterling now faced the delicate task of building a case against a woman who had successfully manipulated an entire community, law enforcement agencies, and media outlets. The challenge wasn't just proving Vivian's guilt, it was doing so in a way that wouldn't destroy public confidence in the police department's ability to distinguish between victims and criminals. The detective knew that confronting Vivian directly was crucial, but it would require a strategy that accounted for her intelligence, her medical knowledge, and her demonstrated ability to manipulate people's emotions. She'd fooled everyone once, and she would undoubtedly try to do it again when faced with exposure. As Sterling prepared for what would be the most important interview of his career, he couldn't help but admire the sophistication of Vivian's deception, even as he was appalled by its callousness. She had created a perfect crime by becoming the perfect victim, and only the most advanced forensic science had been able to reveal the truth hidden beneath her performance. The confrontation took place in Interview Room 3 at Hampton Police Headquarters on a grey February morning, exactly 2 weeks after Vivian Ashworth's frantic 911 call had set her elaborate deception in motion. Detective Sterling sat across from the woman who had fooled an entire city, his case file thick with evidence that would expose the most sophisticated fraud in Virginia's criminal history. Vivian entered the room with the careful movements of someone still recovering from trauma, her injuries now healing, but still visible enough to evoke sympathy. She wore a conservative blue dress and minimal makeup, projecting the image of a vulnerable victim cooperating with the investigation that would bring her attacker to justice. What she didn't know was that Dr. Vasquez was watching from an adjacent room, ready to present forensic evidence that would demolish her carefully constructed facade. "Thank you for coming in, Vivian," Sterling began, his tone neutral but carrying an undertone that suggested this wasn't a routine follow-up interview. "We have some new developments in your case that we need to discuss." Vivian's composure was perfect, her expression showing appropriate concern mixed with hope. "Of course, Detective, I want to help however I can. Have you made any progress with Derek or that homeless man?" Sterling opened the case file and placed the first photograph on the table, a high-resolution image of DNA analysis results. "We've made significant progress, but not in the direction we initially expected. Dr. Vasquez has completed her forensic analysis, and we need to discuss some inconsistencies in the physical evidence." For the first time since Sterling had known her, Vivian's mask slipped slightly. A micro-expression of concern flashed across her features before being quickly suppressed, but the trained detective caught it. She was beginning to realize that her perfect plan might have imperfections she hadn't anticipated. "I'm not sure I understand," Vivian said carefully. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Dr. Vasquez entered the room carrying a laptop and several evidence bags. Her presence immediately changed the atmosphere, from interview to scientific presentation. "Ms. Ashworth, I'm going to show you something that's quite remarkable from a forensic standpoint. The DNA evidence from your attack scene is unlike anything I've encountered in 15 years of analyzing crime scenes." The forensic expert opened her laptop and displayed a complex chart showing genetic markers and degradation patterns. This foreign DNA found throughout your house, the evidence that was supposed to identify your attacker, shows signs of laboratory preservation. Specifically, it contains chemical stabilizers that prevent natural breakdown. This DNA wasn't deposited during a violent struggle. It was preserved in advance and then strategically placed. Vivian's medical background allowed her to understand the implications immediately, but she maintained her confused victim persona. I don't understand what you're suggesting. Are you saying the DNA evidence is contaminated? I'm saying it was deliberately manipulated, Dr. Vasquez replied, placing evidence bags on the table. These samples show signs of being collected, stored using professional laboratory techniques, and then distributed throughout your home. Someone with knowledge of forensic procedures created this evidence to mislead our investigation. Sterling leaned forward, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used with suspects rather than victims. Vivian, we know you completed 3 years of pre-medical studies, including forensic pathology. We know you've been researching DNA evidence procedures and insurance claim processes. We know you had access to biological materials from both Derek Caldwell and Jordan Hayes weeks before the attack. The transformation in Vivian's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders straightened slightly, her breathing changed rhythm, and her eyes took on a calculating quality that had been hidden beneath the victim facade. She was evaluating her options, determining whether to maintain the deception or shift strategies. We also know, Dr. Vasquez continued, that your injuries were consistent with self-infliction using medical knowledge to avoid permanent damage while creating convincing trauma. The wound patterns, the fabric fibers embedded in the cuts, the precise placement to avoid major blood vessels, everything points to someone with anatomical training. Sterling placed phone records on the table. Your communications with Dr. Sarah Mitchell at Norfolk Medical Laboratory show you were researching DNA preservation techniques. Your browser history reveals extensive research into forensic investigation procedures and insurance fraud. Your financial records show you were facing complete economic collapse. Vivian sat silently for nearly a minute, her mind working through scenarios and calculating odds. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. Gone was the trembling victim, replaced by someone coldly analytical. Hypothetically, she said, if someone were desperate enough to consider such an elaborate plan, they would need to account for every possible forensic technique, every potential investigation avenue, every way the deception could be exposed. They would need to be smarter than the investigators, more thorough than the forensic experts, more convincing than any actor. Sterling felt a chill at her casual shift into discussing the crime in hypothetical terms. Hypothetically, that person would also need to be willing to destroy innocent lives. Derek Caldwell was ready to lose everything. Jordan Hayes was facing a life sentence. An entire community was traumatized by fear. Hypothetically, Vivian continued, her medical precision now applied to criminal analysis, that person would be facing complete personal and professional destruction. Business failure, criminal tax charges, foreclosure, bankruptcy, public humiliation. They might calculate that an elaborate deception causing temporary suffering to a few people was preferable to genuine destruction affecting many more. Dr. Vasquez presented her final piece of evidence, security footage from the dumpster where Vivian had disposed of the torn clothing used to stage the attacker's presence. There's nothing hypothetical about this video showing you discarding evidence 2 days after reporting the attack. The footage was damning and undeniable. Vivian watched, herself on the screen, her movements careful and deliberate as she disposed of materials that would have implicated an innocent person in a violent crime she had orchestrated. The DNA analysis was my mistake, Vivian admitted, her voice now carrying the clinical detachment of someone discussing a failed experiment. I researched forensic procedures extensively, but I couldn't have known about advances in degradation timing analysis. I planned for the forensic science of 2 years. Chago, not today's capabilities. Sterling felt a mixture of satisfaction and revulsion as Vivian's confession emerged. The perfect victim was revealing herself to be the perfect criminal, someone who had calculated human suffering with the same precision she'd once applied to medical diagnoses. The insurance payout wasn't just about money, Vivian continued, apparently finding relief in finally discussing her plan openly. It was about time, about creating a narrative that would make me sympathetic rather than suspicious, when the financial investigations began. A trauma victim gets help and support. A tax evader gets prison. Foundation of the investigation crumbled, revealing the depth of her deception and the sophistication of her manipulation. Vivian Ashworth, you're under arrest for filing false police reports, insurance fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud, Sterling announced in the interview room where her confession had unfolded. You have the right to remain silent. But Vivian was no longer silent. Once her carefully constructed facade had been shattered by forensic evidence, she seemed almost relieved to discuss the intricacies of her plan. Her confession, recorded over 3 hours of interviews, revealed a mind capable of extraordinary calculation and chilling disregard for the lives she was willing to destroy. The beauty of being the perfect victim, Vivian explained to Sterling and Dr. Vasquez during her detailed confession, is that everyone wants to believe you. Police, media, community members, they all have psychological investments in. Seeing victims as pure and perpetrators as obvious, I simply gave them what they expected to see. Her planning had begun 6 months before the staged attack, when her financial situation became desperate enough to require drastic action. The initial idea came from her insurance agent's explanation of the violent crime rider, coverage specifically designed to provide comprehensive support for victims of targeted attacks. Vivian realized that becoming a victim could solve multiple problems simultaneously. I needed money, obviously, but I also needed time and sympathy, she told investigators. The Virginia Attorney General's office was investigating my business practices. Clients were threatening lawsuits over missing funds. Derek was fighting the alimony payments and threatening to expose my financial problems. I was facing criminal charges, civil suits, and complete professional destruction. The sophistication of her deception extended far beyond the staged crime scene. Vivian had spent months establishing patterns that would support her victim narrative, increasing security concerns expressed to neighbors, purchasing additional insurance coverage while appearing financially stable, even staging minor incidents like mysteriously opened doors and moved objects that would suggest she was being stalked. I created a paper trail of fear, she admitted. Police reports about suspicious activities, conversations with friends about feeling watched, documentation that would support the idea that someone had been targeting me for weeks before the attack. Her collection of biological evidence from Derek Caldwell and Jordan Hayes represented the most calculating aspect of her plan. Using her marketing connections, she'd arranged for Derek to participate in a fake health screening at his office, supposedly for insurance premium reductions. The screening collected saliva samples that provided the DNA she needed to plant at the crime scene. Jordan Hayes had been targeted because his transient lifestyle and criminal background made him a perfect suspect. Vivian had tracked his movements through Hampton, learning his routines and preferences, eventually bribing a diner employee to save drinking glasses and utensils he'd used. The biological materials were preserved using techniques she'd learned from her pre-medical studies and refined through consultations with her former classmate at the Norfolk laboratory. Jordan was ideal because he was already guilty in everyone's minds, Vivian explained with chilling pragmatism. A homeless ex-convict with no alibi and no connections to the community. No one would question his guilt, and no one would mourn his conviction. The physical staging of the attack scene had been rehearsed and refined over weeks. Vivian had practiced injuring herself, using medical knowledge to create convincing trauma while avoiding permanent damage. She'd studied wound patterns from her forensic pathology coursework, learning to create defensive injuries that would appear authentic to emergency room physicians. The key was making the injuries look worse than they were, she revealed. Superficial cuts that bled dramatically, bruises created with makeup techniques enhanced by actual minor trauma, positioning that would photograph well for evidence documentation. Dr. Vasquez was particularly interested in how Vivian had managed the DNA evidence placement. The distribution was almost too perfect, the forensic expert noted. Every sample was exactly where standard investigation procedures would look first. I researched Hampton Police Department protocols, Vivian admitted. Crime scene processing procedures, evidence collection standards, forensic analysis timelines. I knew exactly how the investigation would unfold because I studied your department's training materials and case histories. Her manipulation extended to psychological elements that had convinced even experienced investigators. The emotional responses during interviews had been carefully calibrated to match trauma victim profiles she'd researched through psychological journals and victim advocacy resources. Genuine trauma victims often can't remember details clearly, but they desperately want to help catch their attackers, Vivian explained. I provided the level of detail that suggested I was fighting through trauma to assist the investigation, while ensuring every detail supported the narrative I needed you to believe. The arrest shocked Hampton's community, but the revelation of how thoroughly they'd been manipulated created deeper psychological trauma than the original attack had caused. Residents who'd organized support groups contributed to reward funds and demanded justice for Vivian now felt betrayed and foolish. Derek Caldwell and Jordan Hayes, both cleared of all charges, faced the difficult task of rebuilding reputations destroyed by false accusations. Derek's pharmaceutical sales career had been damaged by media coverage portraying him as a violent ex-husband. Jordan's attempts to find employment and housing had been complicated by news reports identifying him as a suspect in a brutal attack. She didn't just commit fraud, Sterling reflected as he processed Vivian's arrest paperwork. She committed assault on an entire community's sense of truth and justice. Every person who believed her, supported her, or demanded justice on her behalf became a victim of her deception. The case that had begun with a perfect victim had revealed the perfect criminal, someone whose intelligence, medical knowledge, and complete lack of empathy had created a deception sophisticated enough to fool experienced investigators and an entire city. 6 months after her arrest, Vivian Ashworth stood in the Hampton Circuit Court wearing the orange jumpsuit of the incarcerated, a stark contrast to the designer clothes and carefully crafted image she'd maintained during her deception. Judge Patricia Hawkins, a 20-year veteran of Virginia's judicial system, was about to sentence a woman whose crimes had redefined the concept of victimization fraud in the state's legal history. The court has reviewed extensive testimony, forensic evidence, and psychological evaluations, Judge Hawkins announced to a packed courtroom filled with media. Representatives, community members, and law enforcement officials who'd been drawn into Vivian's web of lies. This case represents one of the most sophisticated and callous frauds ever prosecuted in Virginia. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, with Dr. Vasquez's forensic testimony serving as the foundation for the prosecution's case. Her detailed explanation of DNA evidence tampering, wound pattern analysis, and timeline inconsistencies had methodically demolished any remaining doubt about Vivian's guilt. The defense had attempted to argue mental health issues and financial desperation, but Vivian's own detailed confession and the calculated nature of her planning made such arguments impossible to sustain. Ms. Ashworth, Judge Hawkins continued, your actions went far beyond simple fraud. You weaponized the criminal justice system against innocent people, traumatized a community through fear and deception, and corrupted the very concept of victimization that protects genuine survivors of violent crimes. Vivian's sentencing hearing had revealed additional crimes that investigators discovered during their expanded investigation. She had attempted similar insurance frauds in 2 other states before perfecting her technique in Hampton. Previous accidents and break-ins showed a pattern of escalating deception that had culminated in the elaborate home invasion hoax. Detective Sterling testified about the case's impact on investigative procedures and community trust. This case has forced us to reconsider how we evaluate victim testimony and physical evidence, he told the court. While we never want to doubt genuine victims, we now understand that some criminals are sophisticated enough to exploit our compassion and professional protocols. Derek Caldwell and Jordan Hayes both provided victim impact statements that highlighted the personal costs of Vivian's deception. Derek had lost his job due to media coverage and was struggling to rebuild his professional reputation. Jordan had been denied housing and employment opportunities because of his association with the case, despite being completely exonerated. She didn't just steal money or property, Derek told the court. She stole my reputation, my sense of security, and my faith in justice. Even after being cleared, people still look at me with suspicion. Some always will. Dr. Vasquez's continued analysis of the evidence had revealed the full scope of Vivian's preparation and the narrow margin by which her deception had been exposed. If not for advances in DNA degradation analysis developed within the past 2 years, this fraud might never have been detected, she testified. Ms. Ashworth's research was thorough enough to account for standard forensic techniques, but she couldn't anticipate scientific advances that didn't exist when she was planning her crimes. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court had diagnosed Vivian with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial traits that explained her ability to manipulate others without experiencing empathy or remorse. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the court-appointed psychiatrist, testified that Vivian's intelligence and medical background had made her particularly dangerous as a criminal. She understood human psychology, legal procedures, and forensic science well enough to create deceptions that exploited weaknesses in systems designed to protect genuine victims, Dr. Walsh explained. Her crimes represent a new category of white-collar criminality that uses victimization as a weapon. Judge Hawkins sentenced Vivian to 12 years in federal prison for insurance fraud, followed by 5 years for evidence tampering and filing false police reports. The sentences would run consecutively, ensuring she would serve 17 years before being eligible for parole. Additional restitution orders required her to pay back the insurance funds, legal costs, and investigation expenses, totaling over $2.3 million. The sentence must reflect not only the financial crimes, but the assault on public trust and the trauma inflicted on innocent people, Judge Hawkins stated. Ms. Ashworth's actions have made it more difficult for genuine victims to be believed and have corrupted the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. As Vivian was led away to begin her sentence, Detective Sterling reflected on the case that had challenged everything he thought he knew about victims and criminals. The investigation had revealed that the most dangerous perpetrators might be those who understood the system well enough to manipulate it from within, using society's compassion and desire for justice as weapons against the innocent. But the story wasn't quite over. In her cell at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, Vivian Ashworth was already planning her next move, studying legal precedents for early release and researching which victim advocacy groups might be convinced to support a woman who claimed to have been railroaded by an overzealous prosecution. Even behind bars, the perfect victim was still performing, still calculating, still searching for the next opportunity to exploit the system's desire to believe in innocence. The case had ended, but its implications would continue to challenge how society distinguishes between those who need protection and those who prey upon the very systems designed to provide it.